Okay, see one person. You got to tell me who's actually here as you come on. If we actually get people today, I'm not convinced how many we get. It's none again. One again. You're here, type something in, because I can't tell who's actually here until you've typed something in, whether I've got just random people or whether there's people who are actually going to talk to me. Done. So type something, say hello. I don't know who you are. Are you one of my students or are you just a random lurking person? Right, Gemma's here and Eden's here. Who else have we got? Again, got you. Good. Have you all read both of the articles? That's kind of a primary concern. Have you actually read them? Laura's there. Good. Is it just going to be the Stafford lot again? Or all the Newcastle lot being idle still? Good. Are you at work again, Eden, or are you actually doing this one from home? Ugh. Dun. Yeah, you all realise that you would have had your first exam by this point. Your Coleridge, Doll's House, and Hamlet would have all been finished. Then you'd have had half term, and then about one more week of the exams. I'll give it 2 more minutes, people, just to see if anybody else joins us and logs in. Then I'll start asking you kind of questions and seeing what you think. We're up to 7, 8. If you're joining now, just type in. Let's see who we've actually got on here. Yeah, just remember when they do open up the colleges, there will be a set of exams. So if anybody does want to take exams at that point, you'll be able to. They have said with that, though, what's the couple of provisos that it's worth bearing in mind? If you do the exam, when the exam comes out, then it will take whichever is the exam will supersede whatever you've got from the predicted system. So if you get worse in the exam than you got through your predicteds, then it will give you what you got in the exam as your final mark. It won't go back to the predicted grade. So if you retake the biology, you've got to make sure that you're 100% on it and revising for it and kind of ready for it. Has anyone else joined, people? Because I can't see everybody is on. I can see 1, 2, 3, 4. See 6 out of the. You've never not got a U. No. I'm pretty sure most teachers won't be predicting U's anyway. Well, I'd be very, very surprised if they did. But having said that, it all runs through the systems and it all takes into account past grades and the college's past performance. So we'll see how that actually pans out. I've done all my kind of rankings and predictions and things like that, but it won't come through as that for definite. Anyway, let's have a look at, we're at kind of 5 past. Let's have a look at this. Hopefully, yeah, I'm pretty sure she won't have given you a U, especially if you talk about knitting with her. I can't tell you what grades I've given anyone. All I can say in terms of what grades I've given people, you know what marks you've got in the coursework, you know what marks you've got in various assessments throughout the year. I'm basing my predictions on that, taking into account what I think you would have got with extra work before the end of the year. So you can get a good idea of what I predicted you, but I cannot tell you what I've predicted you. There isn't an F grade in A levels, Luke, so you can't get an F. Anyway, right. So let's have a look at this. I'm probably going to do maybe another week or so of these afterwards, and then just keep sending you stuff rather than do anything live. Because with the first years, we're going to have to start using Microsoft Teams and stuff like that. But again, I think it's useful. It just keeps you sharp on the material, just talking through it, reading the articles, just keeps you thinking about the texts without having to really kind of push the revision with it. You'll find a way to get an F. Right, okay. So on my crib sheet, has everybody got the kind of crib sheet near to them so you can kind of refer in and look at the kind of quotations alongside? Give me a yay or a nay, people. No, I'm not going to blink twice for you. Secret codes. Have you got your crib sheets, people? Have you got the sheets near to you so you can see them? Good, good. Yeah, if you need to tab out, I mean, you should still, I don't know, the sounds should still be going. You just won't get to look at my horrible face. Right, okay. So the first thing, and it's Nicholas Visser one that I'm looking at to start with. I think he's quite a useful one. The second one, when I was reading through, I found it useful in helping to understand the text. This one I found more useful in terms of actual kind of views and opinions being shown about the text. So the first thing he kind of talks about is he's basically talking about all of the kind of people from Oklahoma, and he's saying that, well, they're essentially presented as ignorant. They know that things are happening to them, but they're essentially presented as kind of ignorant to the entire process is working against them and what's really happening to them. And my first question here that I've kind of added alongside the quote, would we agree that the Joads are depicted as ignorant to the wider social and economic pressures pushing them, that it remains largely mysterious to them? And I think that's a kind of good one to use and as kind of a setup, because you can think about the course of the novel and how this maybe changes over the course of the novel as well. So again, you've got to talk to me, people. Do you think that all of the Joads are presented as kind of ignorant of the forces moving against them? Do you think that they're maybe presented as ignorant of some aspects but not of others? Do you think that their ignorance or levels of ignorance change over the course of the text in terms of what's kind of happening to them? Do you think that it truly does remain largely mysterious to them as to what's happening? Go on, I want your opinions. How are you going to respond to that? Do you think that it's true or not true? Are you going to agree? Are you going to disagree? Come here, kitten. You can't just let Gemma carry you today. Representation there. Do you think they're all ignorant? Do you think there's a genuine ignorance there? Are they just so desperate to believe, but in reality, they probably know it's not going to be this good? Yeah. So Gemma kind of points out here that at least the way they've lost the farm potentially does remain largely mysterious to them. They never kind of truly understand that. So there's a kind of potential ignorance around that kind of loss. Do you think by the end of the novel, do they understand what's been done to them in California? Do they understand how they're being exploited there? And who do you think, which characters do you think are the least ignorant? Do you think that some characters are more ignorant to this process than others? Who do you think are the most kind of enlightened characters in relation to this? Yeah, good. So Tom essentially is presented as kind of less ignorant in relation to this. Even from the start, there's a kind of more of a knowledge coming through from Tom. Think about the way that he kind of encourages Marjo to almost live like she's in prison, live from day to day, because there's possibly more of an understanding from him. He doesn't want to break the dreams of the rest of them, but he's certainly more of a kind of cynic about the reality. Yeah, Grandpa, and people like Muley Graves, who they they simply don't understand that they've lost this ownership, that there is no way for them to gain it back. Simply staying on the land won't give them anything. So if you were to use this, and they could ask you a kind of question maybe along the lines of, um, American literature often presents people as ignorant of the exploitation to which they're suffering, or something along those lines, or ignorant to the realities of the world, or something like that. You could potentially use something like this to show that, well, you've got a critic that suggests that they are ignorant, and then on the flip side, you can say, well, actually, a number of characters, though, are presented with more of a kind of cynicism coming through them. There's a greater level of understanding given to them. So, with characters like Tom, he understands the system far more. We could also talk about maybe Casey and things like this. The next thing I popped down on the crib sheet, just because it's an interesting piece of terminology, it's not one I'd used directly before. The article keeps talking about an anthropological mode, I'm going to keep mangling it now. I'm trying to say it. So it comes from sort of anthropology as a kind of study, and it talks about an anthropological mode. There we go. We got it better that time. What do you think it means by that? So as you were reading it, what did you think the writer meant by describing as having an anthropological mode? Because it's a nice bit of terminology. If you can get that in there in an essay, then it will help you hit AO1, and show a kind of good understanding. Okay, so he links it into kind of humanity as a whole. Could you say a little bit more than that, Gemma? So, what's the purpose of writing in an anthropological mode? What's so it's looking at kind of humankind in order to do what with them? Mm. My connection says it's unstable, so I don't know whether you can still hear me at the moment. No, so thanks back on. Can anybody add a bit more? Luke, Connor, anthropological mode. What was your kind of understanding of that? Or Laura? Who else did we have? Yeah, so he's kind of reflecting on the era. Yeah, with the overall aim of kind of creating a unity, showing the kind of adversity the migrants face. Essentially, what that anthropological mode means is that he's essentially writing. Yes, it's about broader humanity, although he does focus in on the kind of migrants more specifically. And anthropology itself is studying kind of human civilization and things like this, studying humanity essentially. Here it's about kind of showing us the little bits of the migrant life. It's where he's saying in anthropological mode, it's sort of implying that those people are not of that social group, and Steinbeck's writing to give a kind of understanding of their lives, to kind of write in and explain how they live, essentially. What was my next one? So, yeah, I think the next one was interesting. Yeah, so by Gemma's kind of onto it now, by writing in this anthropological mode, it allows people to kind of understand the different social groups because they've been viewing them from a distance. They don't necessarily understand them before that. And through that understanding of them, it then means they're less likely to kind of disregard each other. Anyway, so my next question that kind of builds on from this, it builds into that kind of discussion that he has about who he sees as Steinbeck's actual audience, who is Steinbeck writing for. And he says that basically he could, and people have said, that Steinbeck is writing a book for the lower classes to make them realize what's happening to them, to provoke them into action. Other people, and it was kind of unnamed author for that. He then talks about Hyman and French, who suggests that the novel is written more for the landowners and the people at the top in order to kind of make them understand what they're doing to the people at the bottom. And then the writer himself believes that Steinbeck is writing more for the general public, those people neither at one end nor the other end, but those people in the middle. So it'd be nice to get a kind of answer from each of you here. Who do you think he's writing this for? Is he writing for the people at the top? Is he writing for the people at the bottom? Is he writing for the people in the middle? Who do you think that Steinbeck is really aiming this text towards? Weird cat. Okay, so he's creating sympathy with the Oklahomans. He's demonizing the monsters of the banks and writing that into the kind of general public, the middle ground he's saying there. Yeah, so Eden's got a kind of different point of view that essentially it becomes a kind of a teaching text. We could describe it as having a kind of didactic purpose. So it's teaching those at the bottom about their exploitation. He's already kind of said that they're kind of ignorant to exactly what's happening to them. So through the novel, it may be kind of addressing those at the bottom and kind of giving them an understanding. What other opinions have we got, people? Does anybody think he's writing it for the people at the top? Is anybody with Hyman and French? Yeah, so there is that kind of potential for writing for those at the top. I mean, think about how those landowners are depicted at the very start of the novel, where they don't even come onto the land which they're taking away from people. So he is kind of situating it at the very start, showing that people are ignorant and kind of blind essentially to the suffering they're causing. So again, the novel could serve a kind of purpose to teach them in that sense. Yeah, and kind of building it in to show the consequences of their action. I think to sum up that one, I think it's a very useful one because you can talk about kind of contemporary reviewers and how they thought of it with the kind of unnamed one. You can talk about Hyman and French and kind of link them in as critics. You can also talk about the critic himself, and you can say that, well, potentially at different points in the novel, he's doing things that would fulfill each purpose. At certain points, he does seem to be kind of invoking anger in those at the bottom. At other points, he's aiming to create a sense of guilt in those at the top. At other points, it is more general and trying to show the suffering. So I think it's useful and it gives, a lot of roots into using the criticism that goes with it. Let's think about some of the later ones then. So this is just a dead quick one to kind of go through. He uses the kind of term Okies a lot. And the kind of critic here says that, well, he's probably doing this simply to kind of distance the reader from those who use the term, to make them see the irony in this. So do you think that that's done effectively? Do you ever consider kind of demeaning and using that term Okies in a kind of venomous way to describe the group? I might kind of just build that into the next one that follows as well. So he talks about kind of positioning in terms of the use of the word Okies. He also talks about the kind of the way the Joads are positioned in terms of the kind of conflict between the kind of communists and those at the top, the landowners. And he kind of tries to distance the Joads from that kind of popularized view of the communists as simply troublemakers, as simply going out of their way, that there's there's no real reason and cause behind what they're doing. Do you agree with that one as well? Yeah. So Gemma's point of view there, nicely phrased. You're kind of implying then that he recognises that, used in the wrong context, the term Okies has quite a destructive power, and that he is actively seeking to neutralise it as a term. Yeah. So he's potentially recognizing that maybe people have been brought into, so responding to Eden's one here, brought into this way of viewing the Oklahomans, and he's kind of encouraging them to challenge that perspective by seeing them as actual people. Yeah. What do we think about the kind of the Reds and the agitators bit? Do you think that a figure like Tom Joad is kind of separated from that, or do you think he's still kind of part of it? Hello, kitten. No, don't tread on that. Don't seem to be getting much response to that one, people. What do you reckon? If I don't get a comment in a minute, people, I'll move. Oh, here we go. Right. Yeah, it's interesting. So you mentioned kind of Tom Joad's criminality here. And I think that is important in kind of looking at the way in which he fits into this. So remember, Tom Joad is a murderer essentially. He has killed a man, but we are made aware from the very start that his kind of criminality, his behaviour, is linked to a kind of self-defense. So rather than simply being a troublemaker, rather than simply going out and willfully being destructive, he's actually presented right from the start as somebody who is simply reactive. So the fact that he is presented in this kind of criminal way is potentially a good way to link in to this kind of depiction of the Reds and this kind of troublemaker aspect, and make people reevaluate that, just as they've had to kind of evaluate Tom's actions and kind of criminality that goes with it. I'm assuming that's what Gemma meant anyway. If it was, very good point, Gemma. Anyway, so let's think about the kind of the crux of the argument as the article kind of carries on. He talks about the ending to the novel, and he essentially critiques the ending. He says that he essentially says at the end of this, the novel fails. It doesn't work at the ending. He says that, like other novels, the genre, it ends in a kind of fatalism or defeatism. So you've got to bear in mind what happens at the end of the Grapes of Wrath with, the floods, with them essentially losing everything, with the family kind of increasingly split up, with them kind of sheltering in the barn, with Rose of Sharon kind of feeding this starving man. So do you think that the novel ends in a kind of fatalism and defeatism? Do you think that it is as bleak as that, or do you disagree? Do you think it follows that pattern of defeatism? I can oppose that to you. What do we think, people? So you're saying you kind of don't see a great deal of hope in that act, Eden? So it does end on an act of kindness. And it's used. Yeah, and kind of force a reevaluation, supplying the old as well as the new. You might do. If you were starving, if there was a genuine starving person, you don't know these weird situations until you put into them. But I do think it's a kind of slightly weird image that, yeah, probably people wouldn't do it. But yeah, there is a kind of humanity in it at the end. So it's not necessarily completely defeatism. There is a kind of an uplifting aspect to it at the end. He kind of goes on within this argument. You're back again, Kat. He goes on within this argument to say that basically Steinbeck gives no solution to the problem. He says he talks a lot about the problems. He says that there are kind of, he challenges it, he sets up the whole scene, but he never really provides a solution. My point here, and I kind of posed it to you, could you use Tom Joad to argue against this point? What do we kind of assume that Tom Joad is going to do? And could we argue that that is the solution then? We don't see him do it, but Steinbeck is implying that Tom Joad is the solution to the problem. Do you agree with me on that? That's how I would kind of challenge that one. Yeah, so we see other acts of kind of humanity. So people giving money to have the child buried in the other camps as well. Yeah, so that kind of biblical parallel, that should come, Eden, from one of my other kind of videos and suggestions as to how we view Tom Joad. Yeah. So my argument here would be, if Tom Joad has got all this parallelism to Peter, who goes on to kind of create the church, and if we assume he's taking on the mantle of Casey, do we not assume that Steinbeck is giving a solution, and that his solution is the continuation of the strikes movement, of the kind of challenge that Casey offers? To me, that's the solution. He doesn't show it directly, he doesn't show it working, but that's his solution. So I kind of disagree, essentially, that he doesn't present an alternative. I mean, you can argue with me on that one, people. You can say that, you can agree with the author here, but I don't necessarily agree with quite such a bleak view of the ending that he gives. Okay. I'm going to move on to the second article. As I say, when I was looking at the second article, I think I found it I probably found it more interesting in many ways than the first article, but I don't think it had as much in terms of kind of opinions within it. It was more of a kind of almost a history lesson article than one that had got necessarily the direct opinions of the first one. But I think it does make some kind of more interesting points, and some of those points link in, sorry, pardon me, to the first article as well, and would allow you to kind of challenge the first article. So at the start of the water article, he notes the promise of water in the wilderness in Isaiah. So he points out another kind of biblical allusion, and we know that Steinbeck is very fond of these biblical allusions, and you can argue that means that kind of the flood at the end of the novel is actually more optimistic, because suddenly, like Isaiah, water in the wilderness, the Joads are given kind of water in the wilderness. It's kind of twisted logic a little bit here. So do you think that biblical allusion does make it slightly more optimistic at the end here? Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? What do we think in relation to that, people? Cat, don't do that. Yeah, so he kind of links it to the end of the drought. It kind of, and remember when that flood's being described in the intercalary chapter, in the middle chapter, that chapter does end with kind of new life coming through. So potentially, yeah. So we can view it as, rather than the defeatism of the previous author, the previous critic, we can say that through this illusion of something optimistic, there's symbolism of rebirth and cleansing. That it potentially does change the ending into something slightly more hopeful. Then what did I have from this one? Okay, so the other thing that it kind of points out, it goes into all the kind of history of this, and unlike the first article, we do get a kind of presentation here of, rather than the Joads being ignorant, the second critic here, what's his name? I've forgotten. Casuto. He kind of implies that the Joads actually understand what they're doing to the land. They understand the long-term consequences. So how do you respond to that? You know, when the Joads were planting all this cotton, do you think that they understood the long-term consequences of this? Do you think that they simply didn't care? Do you think that it's that they understood the consequences, but they were just so desperate? Do you think that they were completely naive to what they were doing? How do you respond to that one, people? The cat just keeps coming out, going out and in and out and in and out and in. You're back again, cat. Yeah, so Eden's point there is kind of key, I think, in many ways. That it doesn't really matter whether they understand what's happening; they have no choice either way. So naive or understanding, they're kind of screwed over essentially. Yeah, so it's kind of endemic across the migrant community. They just want to preserve this way of life. So there's a kind of desperation. I think you can kind of critique Casuto here in that he kind of overestimates the level of education, the level of choice that these families have got, and sort of suggests that they're almost complicit in their own destruction, whereas there's something unfair about that assessment of them, and they truly don't really have any choices about it. So, last few kind of questions around this. I might skip past that next one just because it's kind of going to take a while on that one. Yeah, I think this one's another good one. I can't remember if we talked about the idea of an anachronism. Do you remember when we were doing like Death of a Salesman? Did we talk about anachronism at that point? Did we? Did we not? I can't remember. But anyway, the author refers to the yeoman farmer as an anachronism. Did you all look up an anachronism? What is an anachronism? Somebody give me a definition. So what is it then, Eden? Yeah, something from the wrong period. So the yeoman farmer doesn't seem to fit in with the period in which they're placed. They're an anachronism. They're outside of this place. Could you talk about people in Gatsby as being anachronisms? Who could you apply this to in Gatsby as well? Because you might make a point, something along the lines of, well, it's been noted that Steinbeck presents the yeoman farmer as kind of an anachronism within modern America, and you could kind of build in evidence of that, and you could talk about the technology and things, but you'd want to kind of create a parallel into Gatsby. Yes, exactly. So it seems old-fashioned in the context in which it appears. Go on. Go on, people. Gatsby, Gatsby. Oh, I cut out. The connection's a bit funny. So what I want to know, based on your kind of definitions of an anachronism here, could you apply the term anachronism to characters and figures within the Great Gatsby? Which characters or which attitudes or which kind of ideas could you present as anachronistic in Gatsby if you were looking to create a comparison between Gatsby and the Grapes of Wrath around the point of them both having features that are anachronistic? Hopefully I didn't cut out that time. Have a think. I think there's a couple of ways you could apply it to Gatsby. Go on. Why Owl Eyes, Eden? How are you going to say that Owl Eyes is anachronistic? I agree with you. You want to tell me how, though? Well, I'm assuming I'm going to hopefully. Oh, go on. Right, here we go. Yeah, Owl Eyes is kind of out of place. He kind of recognizes things about Gatsby. I think I'll talk through my response, see if other people pop some things in. Yes, Dan Cody could be one, or Gatsby himself. So, how are you going to describe Gatsby as being an anachronism? So, if we think about Owl Eyes, think about the way he's associated with technology. He kind of crashes the car. He's the one who kind of destroys the car. He's kind of more discerning in this world of the kind of superficial, this 1920s world. He's kind of out of place within that. Dan Cody has brought this kind of the savagery of the kind of West back east to this kind of seemingly more civilized place. So he becomes anachronistic then. I mean, we could describe Nick's kind of morality as being anachronistic. He's kind of trying to be more traditional, but it doesn't fit within this kind of modern America. It doesn't fit with this kind of shallow society that he's been made part of. So if you got other thoughts, kind of pop them in. But we talked about anthropological mode. That would be a nice kind of piece of terminology to work in, to talk about alongside. You can talk about anachronism and how different characters and people are presented as anachronisms in order to kind of draw attention to certain features, to things about society. Yeah, so Gatsby is anachronistic in the rather than being something old-fashioned, he's something maybe too new to fit into that kind of older world and the social cues there. So it kind of almost shifts periods here in the novel between the kind of older, more traditional old rich and the new rich, and where the two worlds collide, the kind of different groups often appear anachronistic in those settings. So Gatsby appears anachronistic within the old rich world, whereas a figure like Daisy maybe appears more anachronistic at that second party where she's there. She doesn't fit into it in the same way. So I'm just going to point out, I'm going to kind of use a couple of the other points here together just to kind of draw the discussion to a close, because I want to kind of cut it off at about the hour mark for this one. So it makes a couple of points here, kind of edging onto the ending of the novel. It talks about the kind of the burial of the child, and it talks about that as kind of seizing a water asset. And it also talks about the ending of the novel, and it makes it kind of more optimistic. It talks about Rose's act here. Her act and the old man's condition represent the succouring of an infant movement towards social change. So the implication is that Rose's act is not simply meant as the act of an individual, it's meant to be a symbolic act. So basically, this author is saying, or this critic is saying, the ending of the novel is more optimistic than the ending that the previous critic kind of gives it. So I just kind of close it off. Whose side are you on? Do you agree more with the second critic's assessment of the end of the novel, or do you agree more with the first critic's assessment of the end of the novel? What do we think, people? Do you agree more with one or the other? What do you think about this one? Right, so Gemma's more on the side of this one then. Yeah, what we've got at the end of the novel is actually kind of an emerging unity that he's been pushing through for the whole thing. So it does represent an infant movement towards social change rather than something bleaker where it's simply a kind of desperate individual action. A bleak ending then, and potentially this kind of showing a more realistic kind of depiction of what's going on, where it's not down to the migrants to kind of solve their own problems. It's got to come from outside. So it kind of almost implies two different responses here. One where the migrants have a power to create change, the other where outside groups are kind of pushed to make the change here. That it's kind of a combination of both. Right, I'm going to kind of cut it there because we're kind of moving on towards the hour kind of mark, people. It's half term next week, so you would have had kind of your time off between exams. I'm going to dig out another couple of pieces of criticism, probably around Coleridge this time. And then I'll do one more of these after half term. And then after that, I'll keep sending you bits and bobs, just because if anybody does want to do the exam, it'll still be a while away. But I won't keep doing the live sessions, because the way that we deliver into the first years is going to make that kind of more difficult to manage time-wise. Any questions, people? Anything you'd like to know before I end the stream? Good cat. Yeah, I think Gemma's definitely getting a lot from the reading of these. I say I wish that I'd known that this was there as a resource longer ago, because I think some of these articles are very, very useful, but they're very, very difficult to get hold of if you don't have one of the journal archives. I really would recommend, like, you use these articles to start prepping yourself for your university courses as well. You know, these are the kind of articles you'll have to read for university level. So just keep reading them now, keep working on them, keep thinking about them in the way that we're thinking about them. And I can't remember what you've all applied for, but just search the archive for various different useful bits. As I say, hopefully none of you will want to take the exam after your results come out. Hopefully they're all perfectly fair and they give everything that we've kind of predicted. We'll just have to kind of wait and see. I'm going to go anyway, people. As I say, I'll send you out something. Keep an eye on your emails. And we'll have one more of these after the half term. Okay. Bye-bye for now.